have Cindy Gilbert from the Biomimicry Institute, who's going to give us an introduction to biomimicry. The Biomimicry Institute is a fairly recently established organization in Missoula. I just heard from Cindy, which I kind of like. Being English, I wanted to repeat this. The director, Janine Benyus, who some of you might know, might have seen on campus before, good friend of Prince Charles's. I've always admired Prince Charles a little bit for sort of getting involved in issues like architecture and organic agriculture. And so it's nice to hear that there's this sort of Missoula High Grove House connection. Cindy works part of the time at the Biomimicry Institute and is also a doctoral candidate here in wildlife biology at the University of Montana, doing research on Arctic seabirds. So you can see Montana is, I suppose it's on the way north, right? So we're very grateful that Cindy made time to come and talk to us today, so I'll turn it over to Cindy.
Well, thank you, Christopher, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's really great to see so many people enthusiastic about this subject. Just so you know, I have this big thing in my pocket that I normally don't carry around, so hopefully it won't fall out. I'm here today to talk about biomimicry, and specifically how biomimicry can be used as a tool to help us find design solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And so I'm calling the title of the talk today, Nature's Recipe for Sustainability, because the key to biomimicry as being a tool is really the ability to pull the recipes from nature, the actual design solutions from nature in order to help us solve our problems. To figure this out, here we go. So before I get into the nuts and bolts of what biomimicry really is, I'd like to share a little story with you, and actually this is a Montana-based story. I chose one specifically about Montana instead of the high Arctic. But I wanted to share this story with you because I feel it really captures the essence of what biomimicry means to me, and also the way I understand it from what Janine Benyus has been telling us. So I was actually wandering around on the Rocky Mountain front not that long ago. It was about maybe a month ago when it was extremely hot still. And raise your hand if you've ever been to the Rocky Mountain front or to eastern Montana. Okay, so I'm sure most of you will agree with me that that area can be extremely hot, extremely dry, very, very sunny, and extremely windy. So I was wandering around with my big sun hat and my sunglasses and my sunscreen, all these ways to help to protect myself from the environment that I was inhabiting, and just wondering to myself, how is it possible for all of these grasses, all these species, these birds, these animals that are living out there to actually exist here without drying up and blowing away? Because it's really the common theme out there. And then I noticed off in the distance, in the horizon, there was this green beacon. And so I thought, I'm going to go toward that green beacon because to me, green means life, green means water, green means cool. So I thought, well, let's walk down there and see if I can get some reprieve from this hot weather. So as I made my way down toward the green, I realized that it was an aspen grove. And I am particularly fascinated by aspen groves. I think they're just the most amazing, aspens are the most amazing organisms. From a natural history standpoint, so my background is in biology, and so I've learned all about the natural history of aspens. So I had already learned a lot about nature and a lot about these aspen groves, but I had an epiphany that day, and it was related to biomimicry. And that is, when I entered the aspen grove, the habitat completely changed. It was cool in there, it was moist in there, there were green grasses, wildflowers all over the forest floor. Aspens have these amazing hinged leaves to allow sunlight and water to penetrate down to the forest floor. It was a completely different environment than the one I had just stepped out from. And so the lesson from that was that I could not only learn about nature, about aspen groves, but I could learn from nature. Because in this situation, the aspen grove actually created a better place. So the take-home message is that life itself can create a better place. And we're part of life, and we can too create conditions conducive to life, just like this aspen grove. So that, to me, in a nutshell, is what biomimicry is all about. Biomimicry as a concept is not new. Not new at all, actually. It's been going on for hundreds of years, where people actually use biology to inspire, or natural organisms, to inspire design. And the big distinction that Janine made in her book, which was published in 1997, and it's called Biomimicry Innovation Inspired by Nature, the big distinction that she makes is between this design, the design solutions that are actually inspired by nature, creatively inspired by nature, and the designs that actually are pulling out the life lessons from nature. So actually bringing it a step farther to think about sustainability. She defines biomimicry as a conscious emulation of nature's genius. And in my mind, when I think of a genius in nature, I think of the owl, or the wise owl. And of course, we know this human genius, Albert Einstein. I'd like to just take a minute to delve a little deeper into that actual quote, the conscious emulation of nature's genius, because there's a lot of really important words there that she's specifically chosen to define biomimicry as she knows it. So the conscious part, actually, it describes intent. So what is the intention? We need to be fully intentional in our means to come to design solutions. So actually going in and looking at nature with the intention to find a solution that's in context with a habitat and in context with Earth. Emulation, of course, is the mimicking part, right? To be like something. And in particular, not just taking a blueprint or a copy of an organism, but again, taking it a step farther and looking at either the form, the structure, the process, or the system, and pulling out the important strategies that might help us in a specific design problem. And then, of course, the nature's genius part, that's more self-explanatory, but the idea behind that is that a lot of organisms have been here much, much, much longer than we have. And that humans, in the evolutionary time scale, are actually really young. We're a really young species. So we have a lot that we could learn, potentially, from nature and from these organisms that have gone through 3.8 billion years of research and development. And so that's our genius part. I wanted to throw up just a few different organisms that I personally feel are really inspirational, and I'm calling it the Gallery of Geniuses. And really this is meant just to show you that this is the tip of the iceberg. So depending on who you talk to, we have between 10 to 100 million organisms that we could actually look for design solutions. Okay? And each organism doesn't just have one strategy, one successful strategy. It has numerous. So these are, how many I have up here? 6 organisms. In the top corner, that's an electric eel. The really incredible thing about an electric eel, and I'm sure most of you know, is that it can pack a powerful punch. Okay? So it acts like a battery. But the special thing about the electric eel is that it's able to produce 600 volts at one time. It can sustain it for over an hour. And it does this underwater without electrocuting itself. And it does it within its body. So that organism has some strategies that we can learn, from, and especially when we're thinking about developing batteries, because right now batteries are one of the limiting factors for alternative energy solutions. Really cool animal. These 2 organisms on the bottom, the frigate bird and the sage grouse, Montana native, they have a really cool feature in that they have this expandable pouch. And it turns out that the material that makes up these expandable pouches is called auxetic. And it's a special hourglass-shaped material that's able to elongate and expand and then retract again. And it's actually found in pregnant bellies. It's found in penguin gullets, so they can eat a whole lot of krill and carry it back to their nest. So it's found in a lot of different organisms, so it's a common strategy. But the interesting thing is that you might think, well, researchers or people that are looking for design solutions might automatically try and use this design solution to make expandable bags or something like that, which is a potential. But what scientists actually are looking at this design strategy for is for sound reduction. So because it's able to expand and basically collect the sound and reduce it. So it's a really cool strategy, but kind of different application than you might first expect. And then in the middle, of course, we have the hippo. And the hippo is really cool because the hippo actually produces its own sunscreen. It sweats orange pigment, which protects it from the sun. So we could learn something about that for our own protection. Up in the top quarter, we have a flea. And the coolest part, I think, about the flea is its knees. So they're filled with this material called resilin. And resilin is just this amazing substance that when it's compressed, it actually stores energy. So the way a flea's knee works is that when it wants to jump, it actually releases that compressed energy and shoots up. And just a little factoid, a flea can actually jump the equivalent of us jumping the height of an Eiffel Tower, the Eiffel Tower. So that's a really big distance, and that's in one jump. And they actually have these special air bags that are released in their legs to actually slow them down once they've reached their altitude and to drop down again. It's pretty cool. So the one at the very top there in the middle, the black and white one, is a tick. Raise your hand if you know ticks. You've heard of ticks. Okay, I thought so. Raise your hand if you love ticks. Oh, we have a couple of people. Okay, great. That's awesome. Well, I thought I would be completely alone because I actually have a deep love-hate relationship with ticks. I hate them, of course, for crawling all over my body and embedding themselves into me and engorging on my blood. But, for those minor details. But I happen to just love them. I really admire their different strategies. I mean, I could spend the next hour talking just about ticks and how cool ticks are, because they just have phenomenal strategies. But one strategy that scientists have been looking at in particular is their antihistamine ability. They actually inject antihistamine into your skin when they bite you or when they insert their proboscis, which is called a hypostome. And that is the reason why they can stay embedded in your scalp for up to 22 days without you noticing, because they actually shut down your histamine response. So very, very cool strategy, and that's just one of about 14. So anyway, this is just to give you an idea that this is really literally the tip of the iceberg. There's, that's 1/9, not even. It's only 5 organisms out of potentially 10 million. So we have a lot we could definitely learn from nature. But the big question is, what will we ask nature? I mean, what's worth asking nature? And I think it's worth contemplating that, because really, we could ask nature anything, and we probably will. But what I would like to express today is the potential of asking nature for design solutions to help us solve these human problems that have global implications. Okay, so the sustainability speed bumps, I like to call them. So what will we ask nature? What will we turn to the experts for? I think there are 3 main questions that we should delve into in order to get to this next level of sustainability. And the first one is, how does nature, or how does life, make things? The critical difference between the way most of how life makes things and how we make things is that we tend to do things with the heat, beat, and treat method. I'm sure most of you have heard that, where we dump in a bunch of resources into a pot, we heat them up to extreme temperatures, we beat them with extreme pressures, and then we usually treat it with some sort of chemical. So that's the way we make things. And in doing so, we actually lose about 96% of the resources we put into our product development. And that's through shipping and through heat loss and energy loss. Life doesn't do that. Okay, life can't afford to do that. So this is a really important question to ask nature. How does life make things? The second really important question to ask is, how does life make the most of things? So I just described how we generally make things, which is to pour in all these resources and carve away what we don't want to get what we want. Nature actually builds upon itself. So it adds information to something that already exists. And it does that through evolution. So we have to remember that there's been a lot of time that's passed, and the only way that organisms are successful in their design is if they pass on their genes. So through this billions of years of research and development, they've learned how to add onto their structure to make it perform well in whatever habitat they're working in. So these are two different structures. One is a pollen grain right here. It actually builds this shape by adding layer upon layer upon layer through self-assembly. And it's actually got this really interesting shape, and it's meant to travel through air. So by its shape alone, that it form follows function. It actually tumbles through air really effectively till it gets to the place it's going to land. And on the far side there, that's a diatom, which is a marine organism, and it's meant to travel through water. So it moves really effectively through water, and then it settles on the bottom of the substrate anyway, the bottom of a lake or bottom of the ocean. So how does life make the most of things? The third and final really great question, I think, to ask nature is, how does life make things disappear? Okay? We demand from our products that they're durable, that they're long-lasting, that they can stand the test of time. But when we're done with them, we throw them away and we wish they would just disappear, right? I think that's the nature of a landfill. You put things in a landfill, you cover it up, and you hope that it will disappear one day. Well, we can actually look to nature for design solutions to help us understand how we can develop products that do what we want them to do, and then they still disappear. This is a blue mussel, and these long lines are actually called byssal threads. And blue mussels have a really interesting strategy in that they have time degradation of their byssal threads. So after 2 years of their generation, they're timed to break down. Okay, so we can learn some things about how to make the things we have disappear when we don't want them anymore. I'd like to spend the next chunk of time actually talking about what I consider to be some of nature's best ideas, especially related to sustainable solutions to these global problems. This is just a moon jelly, and this happens to be my favorite organism, so I thought I'd put a picture of it up there. So the first great idea is to use CO2 as a feedstock. So with all the conversation about climate change, global warming going on, CO2, carbon dioxide, has become sort of an evil gas, right? Heightened levels, we're really worried about how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, and that's a serious concern. But I would encourage you all to step back and think about the importance of CO2 in our lives. All of these organisms here, these seashells, couldn't exist. These marine organisms could not exist without CO2. They require carbon dioxide in order to build those shells that protect them within their environment. So it's not necessarily, it's kind of a perspective thing. So maybe we should turn this problem on its head and think about how we can use CO2 to produce products that will be useful to us and help us get rid of this CO2 in the atmosphere. So one researcher that's doing just that is Dr. Coates at Cornell University, and he's come up with a really fascinating, it's a whole research program, but he actually takes the waste from citrus fruits, especially oranges and lemons, but he also uses limes, and he actually extracts the essential oils, which is about 95% of orange peels. Excuse me. He extracts that, and he oxidizes it, and so he gets this one feedstock compound. And then he uses CO2 as his other feedstock, and then he has a special catalyst that he's actually developed along with his graduate students in his lab to bring this together and produce a biodegradable plastic. So just to give you an idea of how significant this finding is, I'll give you a couple little factoids. We use 100 trillion plastic bags worldwide every year. 100 trillion. So, and that's just one plastics application. In the US alone, we use over 100 billion plastic bags every year. And that's about equivalent to 12 million barrels of oil. When we think of plastics, the first thing that should come to our minds, and it definitely comes to my mind, is petroleum. Because all the plastics that we have are petroleum-based for the most part. So this sort of finding is just really phenomenal, and it's just the beginning of a great spiraled upward. Oops, clicked too fast. The second great idea is to stay healthy without an arms race. So just imagine a world where we didn't need to use biocides. I mean, it seems crazy, right? How is that possible? Imagine a world where we didn't need antibiotics, and there was no such thing as antibiotic resistance. I mean, it just seems too crazy. But I'm going to show you a couple of examples here of researchers that are doing just that. Dr. Douglas at University of Alaska is actually studying these guys. They're crested auklets, and they're seabirds that nest along the Aleutian chain in Alaska. And I'm a big fan of seabirds, as you know, so I had to have a seabird in my talk. But these guys are especially special seabirds in that they smell like tangerines. And I can attest that because I've actually met crested auklets, and they really do smell like tangerines. And because they smell like tangerines, because they exude this pheromone that has this tangerine smell, they actually repel mosquitoes naturally. So all their counterparts that nest alongside of them, the least auklets, the whiskered auklets, all the other seabirds, they have to deal with biting insects all the time. But these guys don't. They have this natural chemical that does it for them. So Dr. Douglas is actually looking at this chemical structure and producing it synthetically for insect repellent. Very cool. Here we go. Okay, the second great idea that is related to this antibiotics that I mentioned is the ability to repel bacteria and molds without antibiotics. So Dr. Steinberg is a researcher who's from Australia and now has created a company called Biosignals. And he just made the most amazing discovery, and it was kind of by accident. And I just love these sort of stories of research by accident. He is a marine ecologist that was scuba diving around all the time, studying his algae. And he noticed time after time that one species of red algae just wasn't slimy. Raise your hand if you've ever been snorkeling or scuba diving in a marine environment. Okay, a few of you. Raise your hand if you know that everything's really, really slimy. Okay, great. So, but this guy wasn't, right? This red algae did not get slimy, and he was, perplexed by that. So he actually went back to his research institution and met with a colleague of his, a microbiologist, and said, what's the deal, with this red algae? Why isn't it slimy like all the rest? And of course he's like, oh, you just sampled it wrong, go sample it again. And again, he collected samples, and they just weren't slimy. It turns out that this red algae produces a chemical that's called a furanone that actually inhibits bacteria from not landing, but actually forming colonies, which colonies of bacteria are what cause that really slimy layer. So really incredible discovery, all by accident, just a strange observation. And it turns out that furanones can be produced very inexpensively and synthetically. And so there's a company in Japan that's actually working on producing that now and marketing it. And the applications really are endless. This is another story that I could spend the next hour talking solely about it. But some of the obvious applications are for embedding it into materials in water towers so you don't get that buildup of bacteria which causes us to get sick. Putting it in our mouthwash, reduce tooth decay because you're not getting the bacterial buildup. Pipelines, one of the reasons why pipelines actually break down is because there'll be a fracture in the coating, the surface coating, and then bacteria are able to get in there and work on it and cause it to rust and break down. Just endless applications. Really great story. So the next great idea that, go ahead.
How is that different from antibiotic?
So antibiotic is very different in that what we're trying to do with antibiotics is actually kill bacteria. This is actually repelling them. So you don't even deal with the bacteria itself. You actually are plugging the receptors of the bacteria. It's almost like plugging their ears, except they don't have ears, and causing them to keep moving by and find a different surface to land on. Does that make sense how it's opposite? You're not actually killing the bacteria, but okay. So preserve without preservatives. That's the next great idea from nature. So we have over here on the right-hand side, I guess your left-hand side, is a crustacean. And they have a natural preservative in them. They're able to inhibit breakdown. But generally the way we preserve things is to add a whole lot of preservatives, chemical preservatives to our products. And it says here, I loved this ad because it says it's really the STA, Stay Fresh wrapper that keeps the bread really fresh, but I would argue it's probably all the preservatives that are in the bread. So this is, again, a really special story about a researcher, Dr. Hosner at Cambridge, and he has a company, Cambridge Biostability, and he's been looking at tardigrades. Raise your hand if you know this organism, a water bear, tardigrade. You might have seen it in your first year biology class, because normally they get people to go out, sample the puddles around the campus, because they occur all over the world, sample the puddles, and look at these guys under the microscope. Really fascinating guys, and you can see where they get their common name, the water bear, because they look like a bear. But they have a really special ability, and that is when those puddles dry up, they can actually desiccate themselves in a sugar solution for up to 200 years. I mean, it's phenomenal. And that stage is called the TUN stage, the TUN stage. This TUN stage is what's been fascinating Dr. Hausner because he sees a direct application for preserving vaccines. If you know about vaccines, you know that people need them all over the world, and it's a huge problem to transfer and transport vaccines across the world because they need to be kept cold all the time. If anywhere along that transportation pathway the cold chain's broken down, the vaccine's rubbish. It's no good. He has been investigating the strategy that the tardigrade uses in this sugar solution that actually becomes, instead of crystalline, it actually becomes really glossy like amber. He's been using that to actually preserve vaccines. And his process that he's mimicked off of these tardigrades potentially could make vaccines have a shelf life for decades, potentially centuries. So just imagine that we could preserve it in something that's really inexpensive sugar, and it could be transported all over the world and sit on the shelf until the day they need it. Amazing work. The next great idea that we can get from nature is how to get water from air. So with climate change, there's predictions that the world's going to be more arid, and with population growth, more and more people will be moving into arid regions. Also, regardless of that, fresh water is becoming more and more limited just due to pollution and other issues dealing with fresh water. So imagine if we had the ability to capture water from air. Well, there's this little organism called the Namibian desert beetle that's been doing that for a very, very long time and has figured out this process really well. It has these little micro bumps on its exoskeleton, on its back, and each of those bumps have a water-loving and a water-hating, so hydrophilic and hydrophobic property to them, to force water to move along its surface. And how the beetle works is that when the fog actually rolls through the desert, it actually positions itself into the fog, head down, butt up, and expands its wings, and lets the fog actually condense onto its back. And then with the hydrophobic and hydrophilic properties, the water actually runs down into a bigger droplet into its mouth. So it actually is able to drink just from grabbing water from fog. Well, a number of people are looking at this. A number of businesses are looking at this technology, both for the hydrophobic and philic properties to create nano coatings on surfaces to create water runoff. But also architects are looking at how, looking at these microbumps and the two properties that I keep mentioning in order to create water vapors. So the idea with this KSS architect's design is that they have a surface which can be moved into the direction of the fog and to the angle of the fog and actually collect water and bring it into a holding tank so it acts like a well. Really cool idea. The next great idea that nature has to share with us is how to gather metals without mining. So again, just imagine the day when we don't need to dig a pit into the ground to mine precious metals, the day that we can clean up toxic waste sites and very easily, passively, and the day that we can clean up radioactive tailings from old mine sites. Well, someone's actually figured that out, and that's due to the inspiration of cellular biology. So this professor, Dr. DeVoe from McGill University, has been working on this for a really long time. His research was involving specifically the ability of cells to bring in and select essential metals that it needs and to export the ones it doesn't need and to keep the ones it does need. So how it has this affinity to pull certain metals across its membranes. He took that system and that knowledge of understanding those cells and he's actually produced now a library of media, 42 different membranes that have specific affinities for different metals. And so some of those metals are for precious metals, some are actually to clean up radioactive tailings, some are actually to collect toxic metals as well. So the day is already here. This person's already working on this. The next great idea that nature has to share with us is to use only a few good elements, or green chemistry. So we tend to do our chemistry in organic solvents. Life does its chemistry with water, in water. It's all water-based. we tend to use all of the elements on the periodic table, even the toxic ones. And life tends to use just a subset of the periodic table. So we have a lot we can learn from nature. All these elegant recipes that organisms are doing on a daily basis to meet their needs. So this is actually a picture of spider spinnerets, which is where the spider silk is extruded from the spider's body. So spider silk is actually produced as a chemical within the spider's body using green chemistry, locally available resources, benign manufacturing, all these things that we aspire to. A spider's already doing it. It's extruding it, producing spider silk, which has a tensile strength greater than steel if we scaled it up to the same capacity as steel. It's just phenomenal. We really could learn so much from nature. So Dr. Wade at UC Santa Barbara is doing just that. He's looking at how to produce non-toxic adhesives, which humans haven't been able to do yet. And even more importantly, a non-toxic adhesive that actually cures underwater, which is a feat that we just cannot wrap our minds around. Well, the blue mussel has already figured it out. I already mentioned before the byssal threads. This is actually a picture of a byssal thread, a micro picture, and showing all the different qualities of the byssal thread, all the different multi-layering and structure within it. So again, here are the byssal threads. And they actually produce this really strong adhesive, like I said, that cures underwater. And he's examining the actual process that the blue mussel uses because, of course, what does a mussel use to produce the glue? Salt water, right? Have you guys ever tried to collect mussels from the shoreline? Raise your hand if you've ever tried to collect a mussel. You need a crowbar, right? You need a crowbar to get these guys off the rocks. So it's incredible glue, non-toxic, green chemistry, locally available resources, benign manufacturing, all these things just in a mussel. So, and that's just one species. This is a really wonderful story. And again, I love it so much because it stems from an accident. And it's the idea of producing natural flame retardants. BDEs are chemicals that are used in almost all the fabrics that we have in buildings and even in our own homes. All these wall mounts, this carpet, the chairs, guaranteed have BDEs in them. And those are chemical flame retardants to stop this place from burning, right? We don't want to destroy our furniture. Well, unfortunately, BDEs are very toxic. They're known to cause cancer, and they persist in our environment like nobody's business. I also have worked in the Antarctic extensively, and there's actually a couple of researchers studying how BDEs are turning up in krill and also in seabird eggs. So BDEs aren't used in Antarctica, but they persist in the airshed and the watershed. And so finding a natural flame retardant would be an amazing breakthrough. So this researcher, Mats Nielsen from Scandinavia, has actually come up with a technology that will just do just that. It's called MHE Technologies, and it stands for Molecular Heat Eater, which I love that title. But again, getting back to my original point in the story was that it all stemmed from an accident. And it turned out that his grandfather was a welder. That's a picture of a welder over there. And of course, when you're welding, MIG welding, sparks fly. But his grandfather loved to drink cider. And he wasn't really the neatest guy. So I guess he kind of slapped it on his shirt a number of times. But he noticed wherever he had cider spilled on his shirt and a spark would hit it, it wouldn't ignite. So Mats Nielsen, his grandson, actually remembered that story and investigated it and has determined that there's a chemical structure within cider that prevents flames from burning. Really cool discovery. The next great idea is self-assembly. And these are kind of funny pictures, but they're really to remind me to tell you a couple of stories. So again, just to remind you about how we tend to use the heat, beat, and treat, right? The blacksmith forge, you can imagine that, pounding away to get what we want. A lot of what organisms do in nature is to use this process of self-assembly. And this horse is smiling to remind me that his teeth are actually produced through self-assembly. And our teeth are too. And you can think of self-assembly as, or you can use the analogy of salad dressing for self-assembly. So you have oil and you have vinegar, right? You shake it up and it mixes fairly well. But very rapidly, it separates, right? Just due to the affinity of the molecules pushing themselves apart, it self-assembles into these two layers. Well, that's exactly how teeth are formed. right? The push and pull of proteins and different molecules create teeth, as well as nails, as well as seashells, as well as snowflakes. These are all examples of self-assembly that occur in nature. Here we go. So Dr. Brinker from University of New Mexico has been examining how the abalone shell self-assembles. It turns out that abalone is just an amazing creature for a number of different reasons. But the abalone nacre, that mother of pearl sheen that you see, is actually 2 times as strong as our ceramics. Yet we make ceramics using a kiln, right? High temperatures to produce our ceramics. An abalone shell lives in the ocean, and so it uses only its locally available resources: salt water, sand, water, and it self-assembles into this really cool matrix here, which is protein and carbon laid down in a multi-layering fashion into a matrix, which produces a lot of flexibility, but also fracture resistance. So Dr. Brinker has been studying the abalone shell and looking specifically at how this matrix is formed, and he's been able to replicate that in the lab. And it's still sort of beginning of the process, but he's using it right now in a dipping process to actually coat glass, so it's optically clear. You can coat your eyeglasses, you can coat windshields, and again, so keeping them a little bit flexible, but fracture resistant. And he's working with Sandia National Laboratories, and if you know anything about them, they do a lot of sort of NASA space and warfare work. So there's a lot of different applications for this. But from the sustainability standpoint, creating a coating that would be flexible and fracture resistant would just increase the longevity of our products, so therefore you need less of them. Another example of self-assembly in nature is inspired by the Venus flower basket, which is a deep sea sponge, and this is a picture of it. And at the very end of it, it has these long hair-like structures, which are akin to our fiber optics. But the cool thing about these guys, of course, is that they self-assemble. They just use salt water to produce the fiber optics. And I should say that they use bioluminescence, so they do actually use it to move light. But these fiber optic threads, you can actually tie in a knot. They're so flexible, they're so supple, and they move light more effectively than ours. So Joanna Eisenberg at Bell Labs, in combination with Lucent Technologies, is actually looking at how to create these self-assembling fiber optics. The next great idea is to let form follow function, the power of shape. So I just have a couple of pictures here of some flowers, and the common theme between them is the spiral pattern. And there are a number of deep patterns that are found in nature that recur over and over. You know, the beehive shape, the hexagon is one, the spiral is another. And Jay Harmon at PAC Scientific has actually been looking at the nautilus shell in particular, and then also some other flowers, examining the spiral shape and wondering why does this reoccur in nature over and over again. And it turns out that it's a really efficient shape. And he's been able to produce fans that are about 50% less drag than our typical fans and propellers. He's produced impellers and fans for cars, for computers, and now for water filtration. He's trying to give back to produce really energy efficient fans that can be taken all over the world, and they're calling that company Pack Scum for now. I think they're going to be changing that name probably. It's hard to market that one. But the idea is that he that he really wants to give back with this technology that he was inspired from nature for. And this is just a picture of one of the fans. Following that, there's a couple of researchers, Dr. Fish and Dr. Watts, and I just love that fish, like, even though I know whales aren't fish, but just the nominal determinism, I love that idea that you are what you work on. Well, they've been working in a number of different ways, but they in particular have been examining the bumps that occur on humpback whale fins, their pectoral fins, as well as their heads. And biologists, marine biologists, have been wondering what these are about for a long, long time. And it turns out that it actually makes the whale move much more efficiently through water and also through air, so when it's breaching. They have been putting these bumps on the leading edge of airplane wings and also on wind turbine blades. And they're increasing the efficiency by the drag, decreasing drag by 10% and increasing lift by 5%. And another kind of cool side note about that is that they have been quoted as saying that they've never come across a technology that does both in decreasing drag and increasing lift. Usually you find one that does one solution that has one thing and the other that does the other. But this is really cool technology, and actually Dr. Fish was just interviewed. The company is based in Toronto, this Whale Power Corporation, who just interviewed recently and in the media actually a couple days ago, and he's really excited about the different applications beyond just wind turbines. So again, another really cool idea inspired from nature. So I've just given you a whole gamut, 8 different things that we could learn from nature. And the list literally goes on and on and on. And these are just ideas that I personally feel will help us and can help us move toward finding sustainable solutions to our global problems. But what is, I keep asking, what is nature really telling us? Through all of this, through all of the organisms that we look at. And the main thing that keeps popping up to me is that nature knows to put life at the center of its decision making, okay? So in order to pass on your genes for the next 20,000 years, you have to think about what you're doing right now, this moment, within every decision that you're making. And I think that's something critical that we can learn from nature. Again, I talked about my trip to the Aspen Grove at the very beginning, and I think if we can just put that in our back pocket, that we can learn from nature, not just about nature, but actually from nature. And if we remember to put nature at the center of our decision making, it can really take us that step farther to get over those sustainability speed bumps. And I just have a picture of a squirrel to remind me that a squirrel knows what's worth doing, right? It knows when to collect food for winter, to store winter. These animals, these organisms, they don't spend time worrying about what they need to do and if they're going to do this or this. They just know what to do. It's innate. And I think it's also important for us to remember that we're animals too. We're part of nature and we belong here. And we can just put ourselves back in that feeling that we know what to do. We know to put nature at the center of our decision making. And a few questions that I think about all the time and stem from Janine's book are these 3 questions about nature as model. What would nature do here? So asking ourselves when we're going to a design solution, when we're looking for a design solution, we have a challenge for nature. We say to ourselves, okay, we're in this habitat, we're in this environment, this is my problem. What would nature do here, right? What would nature do? Nature is measure. What wouldn't nature do, right? What wouldn't nature do here? It seems really simple, but I think it's a question that we don't often think about. What wouldn't nature do? And then finally, nature as mentor. Why or why not? Why would nature do that, or why wouldn't it? I think if we keep those 3 questions in mind, we'll just inherently protect those things that are really fragile and really important to us, right? It just comes together. It just really, really comes together. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that regardless of what our education is or where we grew up or where we live now, what our backgrounds are, that we all have a few things in common. We all have a few things that rise to the top of our priority list. We all need a great car. No, I'm just kidding. I think those few things that rise to the top of the priority list that we all have in common are as follows. Our air, right? Have people seen this picture before? Yeah, maybe a few people. If you're interested, this is the website. This isn't from the Biomimicry Institute. I just think it's a phenomenal picture to really depict the scaling of what we're dealing with. That little marble is actually the size of fresh air that we have in relation to our Earth, right? This is a priority that should rise on our list. And it's one that we all share. We all need to breathe. So let's go back to those questions. What would nature do here? How would nature clean and protect its airshed? Simple questions. Our water. That's another thing that I think rises to the top of the priority list. This is the amount of fresh water that we have in relation to the earth. Not very much. So what would nature do to clean and protect its watershed? Really important questions. And then finally, our home, right? Earth is our home. Doesn't matter where you live on Earth, Earth is our home. And we belong here. And this is something that Janine, I remember the first time I ever heard Janine speak, I feel like she hit this point out of the ballpark, because she reminded me, and I hope I can remind you today, that we do belong here, that we are part of nature, and we can do something about it, right? Life knows how to build soil, life knows how to clean air, life knows how to clean water, and life makes that really special cocktail of gases that we breathe, we actually require to breathe, to live. And it does all of that when it's going about its daily business, right? The squirrel that's harvesting the nuts. I mean, life just does it as a side note. It just is what happens as a part of making this world a better place. So I think we can take a lesson from that and remember that living sustainably and having those things, meeting our needs, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. We can do both, right? And I think that's so cool. And I think that's where biomimicry becomes really inspirational, because it's this tool that we can put in our toolkits to remind us that we just need to find sustainable solutions, sustainable ways of living while meeting our basic needs. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you for listening. Yeah.
So the source you talked about provides a lot of really great reasons for conserving biodiversity. Because every species has a unique solution to environmental problems. But we're restoring biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. And there's a real paradox there. And that paradox gives me three questions. First of all, I was wondering what kinds of general lessons you can derive from this situation, how we can better protect biodiversity. Second of all, I was wondering what you think of economic arguments for using these kinds of technologies for preserving biodiversity. And third, I was just wondering in particular, do you know if the people whose research you described here are actively contributing to conservation, if that's part of their business model? Okay.
Yeah, three really great questions. And of course, you hit the nail on the head, right? We want to protect what we have, because that's our recipe book, right? We don't want to lose our recipe book. That's our joy of cooking right there. So I can't remember the order in particular, but there are a couple of things that we're working on. At the Institute, we have this new program called Innovation for Conservation. And the idea is whenever the Guild, there's two parts, there's a for-profit part of the group called the Biomimicry Guild, and there are biologists that go into companies, Fortune 500 companies, help these companies find sustainable solutions, work to find inspiration from nature. The idea with the Institute is when the Guild goes and helps these companies, that the company makes a commitment to the Institute to provide a certain percentage of their profits from the product that was developed from the inspiration from nature. And that certain percentage actually goes back to protect the habitat where the inspiration was derived from. So kind of a convoluted route, but it's really making a step in the right direction. And the more and more companies become used to this idea of looking to nature for inspiration, the more they kind of want to be a part of it. They kind of want this stamp of approval, this biomimicry stamp of approval. But I think we're in a really great position where we can say, you really need to show us that you're thinking sustainably, and it's not just about this one product, but it's about your company. And in doing so, it encourages and creates this positive feedback loop where companies are giving more and more to conserve habitat and those organisms. Do companies have this in their business model? I would say generally no, but it's something that is definitely changing. I think the more people demand that companies have this, the more they'll do it. There are certain companies that are becoming leaders, forefront in not just in their sustainable solutions or the green solutions, but actually in the forefront of being a business. So you may have heard of Interface. Have you ever heard of Interface carpets? Anybody? A couple of people have heard of Interface carpets. Okay, so they've been producing carpets for ages. It's a family business. Ray Anderson is actually the CEO of Interface, and he's actually changed his mindset so much because of working with Janine on different projects of different carpet projects, and like carpet eaters. They actually take carpet back and mulch it back up and use it again, and just amazing sustainability, positive feedback loops. But due to his relationship with Janine, he's actually wiping this idea of being a carpet company from his mind. And he's a leader. This is a leader in carpet industry. He no longer thinks of himself as a carpet company. He's a company that's a good business. And what he wants to do is go around and actually start to teach businesses of how to be good business models, or how Interface is a good business model, but teach businesses to be effective. And he can do it from two standpoints, one being sustainability, but he thinks that comes indirectly because you can talk about the financial side of things and say it's only economical to use the product you're putting out. Take it back. Ask for it back. Give people a refund. Take that old carpet back and reuse it because that's materials. And he's talking about mining landfills. I mean, just amazing things like that. So there are business models out there, but they, to be honest, are few and far between. The researchers that I mentioned, because they came from the academic side of things, and most of them are biologists or chemists, microbiologists, they never really thought they would be in this business world. Like, they're kind of shocked about it, actually. But that sort of innocence is really refreshing because they can say, well, I really want to protect, that marine ecosystem where I found that algae. And because that's their secret, they've figured out the recipe, they can demand that from a company. So the power is kind of switching, moving back and forth, but it's not perfect. It's getting there. Did I answer all your questions? Yeah. Okay, great. Good. Go ahead.
You gave lots of really good examples of how organisms or specific species can inspire designs. But I'm curious if you have any examples of sort of communities, ecological communities of organisms, sort of how they maybe self-assemble or ecosystems that might inspire designs.
Another really great question. And I don't know if you remember at the very beginning I talked about the emulation part and how it's important to pull the function, the structure, the process, and then the system. So there's sort of 3 levels there that we can choose from. To be completely honest, the ecosystem side of things or the system side of things is really difficult. And that's where this really important sustainability piece comes in. Places where I have seen that working are in business models. It's actually really interesting. A lot of industries, this is kind of a new thing that's happening with the Guild, a lot of industries are actually approaching the Biomimicry Guild to help them set up their business model and also how they deal with their staff. What's the hierarchy within their staff, and which should they do? Who should they look to nature for inspiration? And the ideas and the inspiration generally come from these ecosystem models. Like, let's look at how a redwood forest or a forest ecosystem works. How do you keep recycling materials? How do you encourage new growth? So that's one example. Another example of a system is you might have heard of the Living Machine. It's a project that David Orr and I think it's called John Todd Designs is working on. And basically it's a building that keeps all of its waste, all of its water, circulates its air, uses filters. It brings everything together and it acts as an ecosystem itself. Okay, it's the whole building. And they literally have a wetland in the middle of the building that purifies the water that comes from the toilets, which they then drink. I mean, it's really phenomenal. So those are a couple of examples. Yeah, Nikki?
Cindy, thank you. I'm wondering, as a teacher and educator, do you have ideas what we can learn from nature about how we approach education?
That's a great question. And actually, that's something that the Institute is working on right now, is how to use our, we call it the design spiral, to actually look at our design spiral, which we would normally use to produce products, but to actually approach our education program. Because the idea with a design spiral is that you're inspired and you move through this whole process and you eventually evaluate. And then you want to re-enter that spiral, just like that nautilus shell. You're going around and around and refining it. So in that sense, you know, we can use biomimicry for education programs. I think the best, or one of the other ways I think it's important in education, I guess there's two different things, but one is the sort of mass seeding. We can think about, you know, Janine as being the mighty oak, you know, spreading her acorns, and from that there are all these other people that grow up with this idea of what biomimicry is, and then they can educate. And so it's kind of moving education that way. Something else popped into my mind and now I've lost it, but does that answer your question? It's kind of a couple of different ideas. Oh, I know. The other idea is actually really tied to what's going on here with this ethics seminar, and for all the students that are part of the, is it called the debating science program? Okay, so the idea is to debate, my understanding is the idea is to bring this dialogue across disciplines, right? Doesn't matter if you're a scientist, doesn't matter if you're a biologist, you know, a designer, a business person, it doesn't matter. It's all about this communication and creating dialogue. And I think biomimicry is a really useful tool, and to not only create that dialogue, but also to act as a thread to pull us all together, to show us that we are all nature. And with education programs, you know, we need to train our biologists, train our business people, train our engineers to be able to talk to each other. Yeah.
So you're given an example of kind of a human mimicry of nature, right? Like kind of cultural, showing examples of cultural evolution through mimesis. And so I'm thinking of kind of the Darwinian model, like how species change, like they're affected by their environments in some sense. And so I'm wondering if there's any examples of interspecies mimicry or mimesis that you can think of.
That's a really good question. And actually, we call it the chimera approach. If you're familiar with the mythical creature, the chimera. And that, I think if I understand you correctly, I think that would be a good example of where sometimes we're looking for a design solution and we know where we're going to be using this product, we know what we want to produce, but we're not quite sure how to get at the solution. And we look to nature, and there's not really one thing, one strategy that nature uses or a certain organism will use that will solve that problem. So what we do is we use this chimera approach where we take, you know, maybe a tick is really able to expand its body, and so that's great for this sort of packaging, but really what is missing is one key factor. So you'll take a strategy from another organism and kind of create that chimera for a design solution. And in that sense, you're kind of melding or evolving the idea, the design solution. Does that answer your question? And I can't think of a specific...
Talking more like non-human species and how they kind of evolve, perhaps through mimicry as well, not just through environmental response.
So non-human.
Because I mean, they probably pay attention to each other too. I mean, they respond in some sense, you know, whether it be on a chemical level or physical or whatnot. So I'm wondering, like, we're responding to them, like, through mimesis, so possibly they're responding to each other too.
I have a good example.
Okay.
Okay. Flowers do this a lot, do a lot of biomimicry. So there's a lot of tropical flowers that reek of dead meat.
Right.
And so they attract bugs because the bugs feed on decomposing clay. And when the bugs come, they pollinate the flowers.
Right. But are you thinking about that sort of idea but in a design space? Or just an example in nature? Okay, well, did he answer your question? Sorry about that. Thank you. Do you have a question?
Yes. So perhaps the skeptic in the room. I see a gap. On one side, we have designs that are, as you say, inspired by nature. And the other side, we have some vision of sustainability. And what I don't understand yet is how it is that because a design idea is inspired by nature, that can result in some sort of sustainable outcome. And let's take as one example, one that you gave of the crustacean that emits some kind of chemical that prevents bacterial colonies from forming. So we're going to take this out of the context in which nature has developed it.
Right.
We can use the term development, subsequent evolution. And we're going to apply it to human health concerns. What's to prevent, for example, something that's happened to antibacterial agents from happening to this one as well? So we have some evolutionary, in scare quotes, mistake that results in some variant of bacteria that can form colonies. In fact, it can become wildly successful as a result of the extensive use of this chemical. And furthermore, if, as you have in answer to a previous question, draw on design ideas from disparate parts of nature and combine them into some, forgive my imagery here, witch's brew that was never created in nature. In fact, it's drawn from such disparate parts of nature that it could not possibly have occurred in nature. Then what confidence can we have, what confidence can we possibly have that we won't create some unforeseen consequences of just the sort that has gotten us into very deep trouble?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's good to be skeptical, I think. I guess related to the fernones, one sort of sustainability aspect of it that I think really applies is the fact that you're not actually destroying anything. This is already existing in the environment. And so it's, like you said, it's a synthetic chemical that's produced and used in applications where we want to repel bacteria. So it's not actually stopping bacteria from existing. It's not stopping them actually from even landing there. I didn't give you all the details, but in that special situation, it stops this bacterial behavior signaling back and forth of quorum sensing, so they can't create this massive colony. And of course, we want to be sure that we're using it in applications that make sense and not on everything. But I don't think that anyone can give you any guarantee that anything we do won't have repercussions. The one thing that we tend to do at least with the design spiral, as I mentioned before, is to constantly evaluate and reflect back onto life's principles. So we think about, what does life do? You know, these questions that I said at the end, what would nature do here? What wouldn't it do? And if we're confident that we're using it in an application that would make sense, then, and also reflecting against these design principles, life's principles, then we could have at least that level of confidence that that's way more than what most products do. So that's one response. And then as for the chimera, I'm always hesitant to bring that one up because it's not really a witch's brew. It's more of the idea of something physical. Like, say a gecko's toe is really good at adhering, but it doesn't quite work for every application. Say you want to make a gecko tape to stick down carpets. They can modify that process that the gecko is using, still using van der Waals forces and a similar structure, but it might not be an exact replica of how the gecko does it. So they might pull in also an adhesive that's non-toxic from a mussel. So it's that sort of witch's brew that we're talking about when I talk about chimera. There's not really a lot of mixed chemistry or anything like that going on. And in fact, when I talk about things at a cellular level, there's a lot of work where researchers are trying to mimic the active site of enzymes versus producing the whole enzyme itself, or harnessing bacteria to produce the enzyme with the active site. So that sort of thing where they're reflecting back on life's principles to really try and make sure that they're doing it the best way possible. But no guarantees.
Just one more question, and that'll be it.
I'm wondering what would not count as biomimicry. So I'm wondering whether BT corn is biomimicry. I'm wondering whether the effort to control, was it snails that they were trying to control with the cane toad in Australia that led to an enormous disaster, right? It worked somewhere else to control this critter, and it was nature's solution. So let's introduce cane toads into Australia. I mean, again, this is a skeptical solution,
Right.
but the fact that a solution comes from the natural world is no particular reason to think that it's, I mean, in fact, I like BT corn. But I'm not sure that it's biomimicry. I'm not sure
Right.
that you would be recognized as such.
Well, again, like I said, biomimicry has been around a long time, and there's a lot of different things going on. Like a lot of different terms are used. Bioassisted and harvesting, domestication, those are not things that Janine would define as biomimicry, although that word gets thrown around a lot. And that's why at the beginning of the talk, I really referred back to how Janine defines it. And as for releasing cane toads or a biocontrol, that's not biomimicry, right? That's actually harvesting an animal and putting an animal in to solve that problem. That's not taking the strategy that the animal might use.
But developing microorganisms that can leach heavy metals from an environment, for example.
Would not be biomimicry.
It would not be biomimicry. But I
Because
thought
you're
this-
still
I thought it was one of
using-
your examples.
Maybe I told you, but it's actually the synthetic membrane. It's not biomimicry. That would actually be bioassistance. That's where you actually take the organism and ask the organism to do that for you. Can you see the slight but distinct difference?
Well, both of them are examples of using solutions that you find in the natural world and
Right.
trying to, in a sense, to co-opt them for our own purposes.
Except one is actually finding the recipe, that elegant recipe that the organism is using, not the organism itself, but understanding, learning from nature, and taking that structure, that process, that system, and mimicking that idea, that strategy, versus actually harnessing an animal, which we've used domestication for centuries, and it's a good process to use, but that's not biomimicry. Okay, can you see the distinction? Because I think it's a really, if other people have been confused about this, it's a really critical distinction. I see one being very different from the other. Bioassisted is not biomimicry, at least as Janine defines it. I want to be clear about that this term biomimicry has been around a long time.
Thanks, Cindy, very much.
Okay. Thank you.